Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I'm doing week 44 of my 2021 reads. This week I finished a buddy read that I've been doing for the past few months, a couple of short things, and I DNF'd one thing. Timestamps and content warnings are in the description box below. The first book that I finished was The Best of World SF Vol.1, edited by Lavie Tidhar, which I have been buddy reading over the past 3 months or so with Becca at Read Becca, who I will link below. I absolutely love Becca's channel and I loved buddy reading this with her. Basically, this is a collection of short science fiction stories, and we just buddy read a couple of stories every week, checked in and just chatted about those stories and spread it out over a few months. It was the most low-key, enjoyable buddy read. I love buddy reading, but sometimes it can be a little bit stressful trying to keep up with the check-ins and getting everything read in time, especially because I'm a bit of a mood reader. But doing such a slow buddy read of a collection of short stories was so perfect. And I just always love hearing what Becca has to say, especially because she's a much better read person in terms of science fiction than me. She knew a lot of these authors and just always loved having to hear what she had to say. So this was such an excellent experience, and the collection was really excellent. So the premise of this is that Lavie Tidhar is gathering together a bunch of his favorite science fiction short stories by international authors, so people all across the globe. Some of these stories are translated, some of them were written originally in English, and many of them are reprints. So if you read a lot of short stories in science fiction, you might already be familiar with some of these, but almost all of them were new to me. There were only a couple of ones that I had read before, and so many of these were just amazing. There were excellent stories, things by Aliette de Bodard and a bunch of new authors that I had never read from before, that I want to read more from before, or authors that I had maybe heard of but hadn't read anything from, such as Karen Tidbeck, who had an excellent story in this. Just if you like science fiction, I really think this is a worthwhile collection to pick up, especially if you're looking to read more internationally rather than just the more kind of US, UK based authors. I thought this was so good. Of course, not every story in this worked for me, especially because, I don't like violence or any sort of graphic body horror or anything like that, and a couple of them had that. There were also a couple of stories that were just a little bit weird for me, but overall I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and I would definitely recommend picking it up. The next book I finished was Alpaca and Apparitions by Andi C. Buchanan. This is number 3 in Buchanan's Windflower series, which I have a review of the first few books of, so I will link that series review down below. And I had been really highly anticipating this book and was so glad when it came in because it was just such a joy to read. So the Windflower series is a contemporary witchy fiction series set in New Zealand, following kind of a bunch of different people who are part of the Windflower family. So the first couple of books follow character Laurel, and then this book follows her cousin Mildred. And Mildred is just wonderful. She is in her mid-30s and she's a fiber artist. So she does a bunch of weaving and other things like yarn dyeing and knitting and these sorts of things. And she's an artist. She's been traveling abroad for a few years, doing a bunch of residencies, grants, things like that. And now she's returned back to New Zealand, and she kind of wants a little bit of time to think about her next career steps and focus on her craft and not just the residencies and things like that. So she ends up getting the opportunity to stay in this rundown little cottage in the countryside, that in return for staying there, she just needs to fix it up a bit. So she does, and she also meets the next door neighbor who is also similar age, a woman who is a farmer / rancher who has some alpaca and is interested in maybe selling off that wool, and they spark up a little friendship. But there ends up being a little bit of a magical mystery because there seems to be a ghost in this cottage, and they have to work together to figure out what that ghost is there for, what that ghost needs. So just like every book in this series, it is so sweet and so filled with coziness. It's a mystery that is about magic. It's very low key. There is a romance, FF romance, but it is also sort of fade to black. So it's just about the sweetness, just about the connection. And there's a lot of focus on sort of internal growth and personal fulfillment in this. Just everybody in the series is wonderful. This is very much a companion novella to the previous couple in this. So even though the first two books center on a couple that make a cameo in this, I think you could totally just pick up this book without having read those previous ones and you'd be absolutely fine. This was exactly what I wanted, everything that I needed. I think I'll probably reread this anytime I'm in the need for a cozy read. I did think that since this is self-published, there were maybe a couple of small areas where it could have used a little bit more copy editing, and there were also a couple of areas towards the end when I felt like the thread of the plot didn't 100% come together as cleanly as I would have liked, but it was just such a joy to read. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I would highly recommend this to anybody who likes cozy mysteries or sweet romances that are very, very low angst, or just wants something fun to pick up. Next, I read Witch Hat Atelier Volume 2 by Kamome Shirahama, translated by Stephen Kohler. So this is the second volume in this Witch Hat Atelier series, and it is just as beautifully illustrated as the first. The illustrations in this are just so gorgeous. All of the line work and the fantastic costuming and all of the magic, it's just really beautifully drawn. And I love the magic in this as well, especially because in the second volume, the main character, who is a little girl who has suddenly become a witch and entered this atelier where she's learning how to do magic, she's still picking things up, and so we get to go with her as she's figuring more things out. And in this volume, she and the other little girls that she is part of this atelier with, they end up having to be very creative and innovative and come up with some new magic to deal with some situations that they're placed in. So that was really cool. However, this one is a little bit, it just feels a little bit more angsty to me, and the plot line somehow just didn't really grab me. I also didn't feel like there was a ton of character depth or growth in this. So absolutely beautiful to read and really cool magic, but I wasn't super into the story in this one. So I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. I do have quite a few of the next volumes checked out from the library, so I'm hoping that the next few will get me more involved into the series, but this one was just okay. And then I did DNF one book this week, which was The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. And I was really sad that I DNF'd this because I'd kind of been looking forward to it. I have a couple of friends who had really enjoyed this book, and it just sounded like it would be a really interesting fantasy, especially because this book is about an orc priestess who basically has a god, the Unspoken One, who as a child she is reared to become a sacrifice to, except that at the last moment a wizard appears and says, hey, you don't have to actually sacrifice yourself, you want to come and be my assistant instead, and so she does. So it's a really cool premise, and I think that the world building in this is actually kind of interesting. This is a world where magic comes from gods, comes from worshiping these gods, and there are portals to different worlds, and people travel through them all the time. It's a normal thing. So there's all of these different worlds, and each world maybe has a god with magic, and some of the worlds are dying, and it's just like really interesting world building. So I was very much hoping that this would work out for me, but I just wasn't into this story. It took me a very long time to get invested in it, and then I just had too many problems, so I ended up DNFing this at 48%. My main issues were that, one, this story was way more violent than I like. There was a really graphic torture scene around the 25% mark that I almost DNF'd it at that point, but I decided to give it another shot and see if there were any more big acts of violence like that. And then I ran into a couple of more scenes where there was just way more violence than I'm comfortable with, and just really graphically depicted as well. So I know that some people are totally fine with violence. So if you are, I don't think that that should be a reason why this book wouldn't work for you, but I'm not into it. And it was so rough reading those sections. Especially the torture scene was intense. And beyond that, I also really struggled to connect to the characters because of the way that the story is set up, where we're following this priestess who was very sheltered when she was growing up, and we start with her when she's maybe 14. She doesn't really understand the world around her. So for the first part of the book, we're kind of being brought with her as she's dragged to different places, and this wizard who has taken her on as his assistant doesn't really explain anything to her. So we're a little bit lost, which is okay in general. I don't mind not necessarily knowing everything that's going on, but it was hard to even understand, what are we doing? Why are we doing anything? So that was okay-ish. And then the writing style was also not so much for me. I just felt that at points it was a little clunky, where sometimes the author would have these little paragraphs of description, and each sentence in and of itself was fine, but the author would have like a simile, a metaphor, an analogy, another simile. It was just back to back to back to back comparisons to other things that felt a little clunky. It almost felt like somebody who was intentionally saying, I need to make sure that I make this a vivid description, and adds in too much. So it just felt a little clunky there. It was not a bad book, but I just struggled to get into it, and the violence made it such that I didn't want to continue. So I totally see why a lot of people are into this book, especially because the world building is so cool, but it just wasn't for me. Okay, so that is everything that I read and DNF'd this week. If you guys have read any of these, if you want to read them, if you have any thoughts, anything at all, just leave me a comment down below.